The alarm clock on the nightstand had not gone off. Harry didn't own an alarm clock, not technically. The battered thing on the shelf had belonged to Dudley once, cast aside when something newer and louder had taken its place, and Harry had quietly claimed it the way he quietly claimed most things in this house, without asking, without being noticed. But this morning it hadn't mattered. He had been awake long before the clock would have troubled itself to ring. He lay still for a while in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling of the smallest bedroom at number 4, Privet Drive, was not a particularly interesting ceiling. It was white, or had been once. Now it was the color of old paper, faintly yellowed near the light fitting where some ancient bulb had burned too hot for too long. There was a crack running from the east corner almost to the center, a thin wandering line that Harry had traced with his eyes so many times over the years that he knew its every turn without looking. He knew the way it branched near the window. He knew the small dark stain beside the wardrobe that Aunt Petunia had never quite managed to explain away with paint. He knew this ceiling the way you know the inside of a place you have never chosen to be, but have been, regardless, for as long as you can remember. He did not look at the ceiling this morning, or rather, he looked at it the way you look at something when you are not really seeing it at all, when your eyes have simply chosen a direction and your mind has gone elsewhere entirely. It was early. That much was clear from the quality of the light coming through the thin curtains, pale and tentative, the kind of light that had not yet committed to being daytime. The birds were at it already, as they always were at this hour, filling the quiet with something that was almost cheerful. Down the street, a car started and then faded away. Someone going somewhere. The ordinary machinery of Privet Drive beginning. Another ordinary day. Harry pushed back the blanket and sat up. He dressed without thinking about it. Jeans, a t-shirt, 3 sizes too large that had once been Dudley's, the same trainers he'd worn on the train back from Hogwarts. His trunk sat at the foot of the bed, still half unpacked. His robes were visible inside it, folded badly. He hadn't looked at them since he'd put them there. He didn't look at them now either. The house was asleep. That was the right word for it. Asleep, not merely quiet. There was something particular about the silence of a house in which people are still unconscious. A heaviness to the air, a sense of held breath. Vernon Dursley's snoring was faintly audible through the wall, rhythmic and untroubled. The snoring of a man who had gone to bed without a single complicated thought and had slept exactly as long as he intended to. Harry moved through the upstairs hallway carefully, not from any particular desire for stealth, but simply from long habit. The 3rd stair creaked. He stepped over it. The kitchen tiles were cold through his socks. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, not doing anything. The room smelled of last night's dinner and Petunia's particular brand of washing-up liquid. Synthetic lemons, aggressively clean. The curtains over the sink were drawn. The clock on the wall read 5:10. On the counter sat a folded copy of yesterday's newspaper and a single mug, rinsed and inverted to dry, waiting to be useful again. Harry did not make tea. He did not eat anything. He stood there in the yellow-grey morning light and looked at the back door, and then, without particularly deciding to, he unlocked it and went outside. The garden was cool and damp and very still. It was a good garden by Privet Drive standards. Petunia tended it with the same determined precision she applied to everything in her life. The flower beds were neat, the edges trimmed, the roses disciplined into shapes they would not have chosen for themselves. The lawn was very green and slightly wet with dew, and when Harry stepped onto it, his trainers immediately darkened at the toe. He walked to the old wooden bench along the back fence and sat down. The bench had been there as long as Harry could remember. It was the color of weathered ash, slightly uneven on the left side, where one leg had settled into the ground at an angle over the years. In summer, when the roses were properly out, it was actually rather a nice spot. Harry had never sat on it before. It was the sort of bench that the Dursleys sat on, Petunia with her cup of tea on Sunday mornings, Vernon occasionally with the newspaper, and therefore it had simply never occurred to Harry to use it. He sat on it now. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the garden. It was very ordinary. That was the thing that struck him, or would have struck him, if he'd been in the business of being struck by things just then. It was simply, thoroughly, unapologetically ordinary. The roses were doing what roses do. The bird from the fence, a thrush or something like it, Harry had never learned to tell them apart, was doing what birds do at 5 in the morning, which is to say, it was making an unreasonable amount of noise for something so small. Somewhere beyond the fence, in the gardens of the neighboring houses, other birds were answering it. Privet Drive was waking up in the same way it always did, in the same way it had been doing since long before Harry had arrived here, and would presumably continue to do long after. The world, in other words, had not received the news. He noticed the ant by accident. He had been looking at the paving stones that ran along the edge of the garden path, not because they were interesting, but because looking at things close to the ground required slightly less of him than looking at the sky, which was doing something soft and complicated with the early light that Harry was not presently equipped to appreciate. The paving stones were grey and slightly mossy at the edges, and altogether very easy to look at. The ant was on the second stone from the left. Harry noticed it first because it was moving with great purpose and unusual slowness, the combination of which caught his attention in the way that genuinely effortful things sometimes do. It was carrying something. A crumb, Harry thought at first, then revised. It was too large for a crumb, too pale, too irregularly shaped. A piece of something, some fragment of something larger that had been broken into pieces the ant could manage, and this was the ant's portion, and the ant was managing it. It was, by any reasonable measure, too large. The ant was carrying something that was clearly at least twice its own size, possibly more. Its progress was slow and lurching, and absolutely without hesitation. It went forward, and then sideways when the terrain required it, and then forward again, navigating the tiny geography of the paving stone with the absorbed seriousness of something that had a very clear sense of where it was going and why. Harry watched it. He didn't think anything in particular while he watched it. He wasn't using the ant as a metaphor. He wasn't thinking about burdens or perseverance or any of the things a person might be expected to think while watching an ant carry something impossible across a garden path at 5 in the morning. He was simply watching it, the way you watch something when your mind has gone quiet and your eyes have nothing better to do. The thrush on the fence sang something elaborate and self-satisfied. The ant moved. Harry watched. After a while, He couldn't have said how long. He became aware that the quality of the light had changed. The pale, tentative light of 5 in the morning had given way to something more certain, more committed to being daytime. The shadows had shifted. The dew on the lawn was beginning to lose its brightness. Somewhere along the street, a dog had started barking with great conviction about something, and an upstairs window in one of the neighboring houses opened and then closed again. Harry became aware, too, that his hands were cold. He hadn't noticed until now. He pushed them into the pockets of his jeans and shifted slightly on the bench. His thoughts had been quiet. That was the strange thing. He had expected. He was not sure what he had expected. When he'd lain awake in the small bedroom, looking at the ceiling, he had not exactly been thinking either. But the not thinking had felt effortful, like pressing against something. Out here, it was different. Out here, the not thinking felt more like weather, like a sky that simply was the color it was, without apology. He thought briefly and carefully about Cedric, not about the graveyard, not about the green light or the sound or Wormtail's wand or any of the things that came to him most nights in a way he could not control or prepare for. He thought about Cedric's face at breakfast, once in the great hall. Harry had been sitting with Ron and Hermione, and Cedric had been at the Hufflepuff table, and there had been some joke going around among the Hufflepuffs, something Harry hadn't heard, and Cedric had laughed with his whole face the way some people do, unguardedly, not performing it. Harry had noticed it the way you notice things about people that you never bother to put into words. He had never put it into words. There had been no reason to. He thought about that laugh now. He thought about it for a moment, and then let it sit there, and it just sat there, without doing anything dramatic, without turning into the other things. It just existed in the morning air, in the same quiet space as the ant on the paving stone, and the dew on the grass, and the birds doing their business on the fence. Harry breathed out slowly. He heard the kitchen window open. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the ordinary morning sound of a window being opened, a slight resistance, the double-glazed seal releasing, the rush of outside air. Harry did not turn around. He knew, without needing to check, that it was Petunia. Vernon would not be up for another 2 hours. Dudley would not be up for considerably longer than that. And Petunia was always the first one to the kitchen in the morning, moving through her early morning routines with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing the same things in the same order for decades. Harry heard the tap running, the kettle filling. He did not turn around. He could feel, though, or thought he could feel, and perhaps it was only imagination, the particular weight of being looked at, the sense of eyes on the back of his head. He had sat with his back to the kitchen window, and he was aware that from the kitchen window he was visible, a figure on the bench in the early morning garden, which was a thing that had never happened before and which Petunia would certainly notice. She did not call him in. She did not open the back door or tap on the glass or say his name in the tight, careful way she said it when she wanted something from him or wanted him to stop doing something. The tap ran, and the kettle went on, and the window remained open, letting in the morning air. Harry looked at the garden. The ant, he noticed, was gone. He couldn't tell whether it had made it to wherever it had been going, or simply moved beyond the range of his vision. The paving stone sat empty and grey and ordinary. Somewhere further away than the garden, a lawnmower started up. Very distant, one of the houses on the far side of the crescent, probably. The sound came and went in the still morning air, steady and unremarkable. The sun was properly up now. The roses cast real shadows. Harry sat on the bench and let the morning happen around him, and did not think about very much at all, and found, almost without noticing, that this was enough for now. Not good, not better, simply enough. The kettle boiled inside the house. Petunia in the kitchen was quiet. The morning had fully arrived by the time Harry became aware of it, not gradually, the way mornings usually announce themselves, a slow brightening, a creeping warmth, a sense of the world easing into itself, but all at once, the way you sometimes surface from a very deep and dreamless sleep, to find that time has moved without your permission. One moment, the garden had been pale and tentative, and almost private, belonging to the early hour in the way that quiet places belong to early hours. The next moment, it was simply morning, ordinary and unambiguous, with the sun at a proper height, and the shadows properly placed, and the whole of Privet Drive going about its business as though business were the only thing there was. Harry had not moved from the bench. He was aware of this in a distant, observational way, aware that his back had begun to ache faintly from the slight lean of the bench's left side, aware that his hands were warmer now than they had been an hour ago, aware that the dew on his trainers had dried and left a faint watermark on the canvas. He was aware of his own stillness in the same way you become aware of a sound only when it stops. By contrast, by the sudden sense that it has been there all along. He had been very still for a very long time. The postman arrived at number 4 at 8:20, as he always did. Harry heard him before he saw him. The particular rhythm of footsteps on the front path, purposeful and slightly heavy, the kind of walk that belongs to someone who has a route and knows it and has no reason to deviate from it. Then the snap and rattle of the letterbox at the front of the house, and the sound of envelopes landing on the hall mat. He couldn't see the postman from where he sat. The garden was at the back of the house, separated from the front by the side gate and a narrow path that Petunia kept very tidy. But he heard the footsteps move away from number 4 and continue along Privet Drive, the same rhythm, unhurried, exactly as it had been, and then fade into the ordinary ambient noise of the street. Something about this bothered Harry, and it took him a moment to understand why. The postman had come and delivered the post and gone. He had walked up the path and through the gate and on to number 5, and the world had continued, and not a single thing in his morning had been any different from every other morning of his working life. He had walked the same route. He had delivered the same kinds of envelopes, bills and catalogues, and whatever it was that Petunia ordered from those home furnishing magazines, she kept stacked beside the telephone. He had heard the same sounds, and felt the same sun, and gone home, presumably, or perhaps had a cup of tea in the van, or done whatever postmen do between one house and the next. He had not known. There was no reason he would have known. Of course, that was entirely the point. But the understanding of it, the clean, simple understanding that the world outside the garden gate had not received any particular news, that nothing in its morning was different, settled over Harry slowly, the way cold water settles, finding the low places first. He thought, Cedric Diggory is dead, and the postman has delivered the post. He did not think it with bitterness. He was not sure what he thought it with. It was simply true, the way a great many true things are simply true without offering anything in the way of consolation or meaning. It sat beside him on the bench, this truth, this particular and factual weight of it, and he let it sit there. At 9:30, 2 children came down the pavement on bicycles. Harry could see them through the side gate, which stood open as it usually did on warm mornings. A boy and a girl. The girl slightly older, he thought, or perhaps only taller. It was hard to tell from this distance, riding without helmets in the particular carefree way that suggested no adult was currently watching. The girl was ahead. The boy was pedaling hard to catch up, his legs pumping with the concentrated effort of someone who absolutely intends to win whatever race is currently being run, official or otherwise. They passed number 4 without a glance toward the gate. They were laughing about something. Harry couldn't hear what, only the shape of it, the high, bright sound of 2 people who have found something very funny and are still finding it funny, carrying it along with them down the street. The laughter faded as they rounded the bend at the end of the drive. Harry watched the empty pavement after they'd gone. He thought about the last time he had laughed like that, unself-consciously, without a reason that he could later explain. The way you laugh at things when you are not carrying anything in particular. He thought about the common room at the end of last term. Before the tournament, before everything, he and Ron had been playing Exploding Snap, and something had happened that was genuinely very funny. Some spectacular cascade of exploding cards that had singed Neville's eyebrows, and they had both laughed in exactly that way, helplessly and without reservation. That had been when? October, maybe. October felt like a long time ago. October felt, in fact, like something that had happened to a slightly different version of himself. He was not sure whether this made him sad exactly. He thought it might, somewhere underneath the stillness. But the stillness was very deep this morning, and it was difficult to be certain what was underneath it. The lawnmower from number 7 had started up shortly after the children on bicycles had gone. It was the kind of petrol lawnmower that makes its presence known over a considerable area. A steady, insistent drone that rose and fell as it turned at the ends of rows. A sound so thoroughly associated with summer Saturday mornings that Harry had a whole architecture of feeling attached to it without ever having examined it. Being inside on a hot day, the window open, the sound coming and going, being on the outside of something domestic and normal. He had always been on the outside, of course. That was not new. But this morning the feeling was different. Not the familiar ache of being excluded from something warm, but something more like bewilderment. The lawnmower was bewildering. The postman was bewildering. The 2 children on their bicycles were bewildering. Not because any of them were strange, but because none of them were. The world was continuing to be entirely, offensively normal. He thought about the night in the graveyard. He had not meant to. He had not given himself permission, but the thought arrived anyway, the way those thoughts always did, without knocking. The torch-lit darkness, the crowd in the stands very far away and entirely unaware. Cedric, beside him, holding one handle of the Triwizard Cup, and the world still a moment before everything changed. In that last moment before the port key had activated, in that ordinary, unremarkable moment. Had the world been doing this too? Had someone in Ottery, St. Catchpole, been mowing their lawn? Had a postman delivered letters? Had children on bicycles laughed about something that was only funny to them? He thought, almost certainly yes. He thought, that is the thing about terrible moments. They arrive in the middle of ordinary ones. The morning moved. Harry stayed where he was. He had lost track of how long he'd been sitting on the bench and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this did not particularly trouble him. Back in Hogwarts, before, he had always had a slight anxiety about time, about being where he was supposed to be, about the particular Gryffindor talent for arriving at things slightly too late or in slightly the wrong way. Now, the absence of any schedule, any expectation, any particular place he needed to be was less a relief than a blankness. There was nowhere to be. There was only here, and the garden, and the sound of the lawnmower from number 7 gradually winding down. He thought about the tournament, not about what had happened, about the beginning of it, the autumn term, the excitement, the names coming out of the goblet of fire. He could remember the exact quality of the great hall at that moment, the candlelight, the silence, the particular electric feeling of something significant happening. He could remember turning to Ron, wanting to share the moment with him, and the way that had turned complicated very quickly. He could remember Cedric's name being called, first expected, properly belonging to him, and the Hufflepuff table erupting in a way that was entirely earned and had nothing complicated about it. He thought about Cedric in those early weeks, dignified, unhurried, not particularly interested in the drama around Harry's unexpected inclusion. Getting on with it. There had been something admirable in that, something that Harry had noticed at the time without having the vocabulary to name it. Cedric had treated the whole business like someone who had entered a competition fairly, had been selected fairly, and intended to compete fairly, and found all the peripheral noise uninteresting. Harry had not been kind about it internally. He had felt he could be honest about this now, sitting in the garden with the lawnmower done and the morning gone very quiet. He had felt the particular sourness of someone who suspects they are being looked down on graciously. Cedric's dignity had sometimes read to Harry as condescension, as tolerance. He understood now that it had probably just been dignity. He heard the back door open. The sound was different from the opening of the kitchen window earlier, more deliberate, the particular weighted sound of a door that has been decided upon. Harry did not turn around. He heard footsteps on the paving stones, not Petunia's neat measured step, but something heavier and more reluctant, something that moved the way people move when they are going somewhere they have not entirely made up their mind to go. Dudley appeared at the edge of his vision. He was wearing the enormous basketball shorts and the oversized t-shirt that constituted his summer uniform, and he was carrying a football tucked under one arm. He looked like someone who had come outside for a specific reason and was now slightly uncertain about whether that reason still applied. He stopped when he saw Harry, or rather, Harry understood. He had probably known Harry was there. The garden was not large enough to miss someone sitting on the bench, and had come outside anyway, which was in itself mildly remarkable. They looked at each other. Dudley had changed this past year in ways that were strange to observe. In someone Harry had known since infancy, he was still large. The diet that Smeltings had insisted upon had narrowed him somewhat, but not transformed him. But his face had done something slightly different. He looked less certain of himself. In all the years of Harry's memory, Dudley had always occupied his own life with absolute assurance, the assurance of someone who has never had reason to doubt his own centrality. Something had shifted in that. Harry was not sure when it had happened or what had caused it, but it had happened, and he could see it now in the way Dudley stood at the edge of the garden path and held the football and looked at Harry with an expression that was not unkind. "All right," said Dudley. It was not a question. It was the thing people say when they do not have anything better to say, but feel that saying nothing would be worse. "All right," said Harry. Dudley looked at the garden, then at the football, then briefly at Harry again. Something moved across his face, some thought or hesitation that he did not share. And then he turned and went back inside, through the door he had come out of, carrying the football still tucked under his arm. He had not needed the football at all. Harry looked at the closed door for a moment, then looked back at the garden. The lawnmower from number 7 had been quiet for some time. In its place, the afternoon was beginning to assert itself. The warmth of the sun had moved from pleasant to substantial. The light had taken on the particular pressing quality of July midday. The roses smelled, faintly, of roses. This struck Harry as the kind of unremarkable detail that would never strike you on an ordinary day. And yet here it was, existing, the roses smelling of roses. He thought about the Hufflepuff table again, about the eruption of cheering, genuine and unguarded, about how a school of several hundred people could love someone that straightforwardly. He thought, Cedric Diggory should have gone home. He had been thinking this, he realized, in one form or another, since the night in the hospital wing, when Dumbledore had stood and said what needed to be said. The thought returned to him with the stubborn frequency of something that would not be resolved by thinking alone. Cedric should have gone home. He had won. The cup had been there. He had reached it first by any fair reckoning. Harry had said so. Harry had stepped back and said, "Take it, it's yours." And Cedric had said, "No, together, together." Harry pressed his hands against his knees and breathed out. He was not crying. He had thought, in those first days, in the immediate aftermath, that not crying was a kind of failure, some deficit in him. He had wanted, in some obscure way, to feel the thing properly, to have it arrive with appropriate force. But it had not come like that. It came instead like this, in the middle of ordinary mornings, in the presence of postmen and lawnmowers and children on bicycles. It came quietly, and it sat beside you, and it did not ask for anything in particular. The world outside the gate still didn't know. Down the street, someone had turned on a radio. Music drifted faintly over the garden fence, something cheerful and entirely uninvested in the complicated business of grief. Harry listened to it for a moment without meaning to. The garden was warm and very quiet. He stayed where he was. The glass of water appeared without announcement. Harry had not heard the back door open this time. He had been looking at the far end of the garden, where the fence met the corner, and a climbing rose had been doing whatever it wanted for long enough that Petunia had apparently given up trying to redirect it. It grew in 3 directions simultaneously and had accumulated over the years a kind of magnificent stubbornness that Harry found just now quietly impressive. He had been looking at it without thinking about it, which was the particular kind of looking he had been doing all morning. Eyes open, mind somewhere below the surface, the world passing over him like light over still water. Then there was the sound of something being set down on the garden wall. He turned his head. A glass of water, plain, no ice, filled to about 3/4, sat on the flat top of the low garden wall that divided the paving from the flower beds. It was one of the ordinary glasses from the kitchen cupboard, the kind the Dursleys used for everyday things, not the good glasses that came out when Vernon's colleagues visited. The water was clear. There was nothing remarkable about it. Petunia was already retreating. She was halfway back to the door, her back to Harry, her cardigan pulled close around her despite the warmth of the morning, her posture carrying that particular quality of deliberate casualness that people adopt when they have done something they are not entirely prepared to explain. Her garden shoes made a soft, precise sound on the paving stones. She moved the way she always moved, with purpose, with economy, without anything unnecessary. She did not look back. The door closed behind her with its usual sound. Not a slam, never a slam in Petunia's house, but the firm considered click of a door that has been closed properly. Harry looked at the glass of water on the wall. He looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something unexpected that has arrived in your space and needs to be accounted for. Then he got up from the bench. His legs were slightly stiff, he noticed, from the long sitting, and walked to the wall and picked it up and drank from it. The water was cold. She had run the tap for a while, then, before filling it, the way you do when you want the water to be properly cold. He stood beside the wall and finished half the glass, and then held it in both hands, and stood there in the warm morning sun, and did not know what to do with the feeling that had arrived alongside the water, which was not gratitude exactly, and not surprise exactly, and not any of the things he might have been able to name if pressed. He sat back down on the bench with the glass. Petunia was visible through the kitchen window now, or the shape of her was. The curtains were partially drawn against the morning sun, the particular thing she always did in summer to keep the kitchen cool, and through the gap he could see movement, the familiar architecture of her morning, the counter, the kettle, the way she moved between the sink and the cooker, with the efficient choreography of someone who has performed the same sequences so many times they no longer require thought. She did not look out, or if she did it in the way that cannot be detected from the garden, briefly, peripherally, without committing to it. Harry thought about Lily. He had not meant to. It was the kind of thought that arrives sideways, not through the front door. Not I will now think about my mother, but simply there she was, present in the consideration of Petunia, the way a shadow is present on the ground when you are looking at the thing that casts it. He thought about his mother, because Petunia was in the kitchen, and Petunia was Lily's sister. And somewhere inside that fact, inside the particular distance between those two things, sister and sister, the kitchen and the garden, the glass of water set down without a word, there was something Harry had never had adequate tools to examine. He knew almost nothing about their relationship. This was a fact he had grown used to carrying without inspecting it. He knew that they had been close as girls in some version of the past that predated everything he knew about the wizarding world and Hogwarts and all of it. He had gleaned this from fragments, an odd look on Petunia's face when certain things were said, a quality of silence around certain subjects that was different from ordinary silence, weighted in a way that ordinary silences are not. He had never asked. Petunia had never offered. Vernon would have found the subject distasteful. Dudley had no idea there was a subject to be found. He thought, did she sit in this garden after the letter came? The letter. He had never seen it, didn't know exactly what form it had taken, whether it had come by owl in the night or by some other ministry method that accounted for the sensitivities of the recipient. He imagined, he could not help imagining, Petunia in a version of this garden, a younger version, sometime in November 1981. The roses would have been done by then. The garden would have been putting itself to bed for winter. He imagined her standing in the cold with a letter or a telegram, or whatever form the news had arrived in, reading it in the way that people read things they already half know. The reading, a confirmation rather than a discovery. He did not know if she had cried. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he genuinely did not know the answer. Not in the sense that he had guessed and might be wrong, but in the sense that he had no information at all with which to even form a guess. Petunia was not a person he had ever been invited to understand. She was a presence, an authority, a set of rules and reactions and precise silences. The interior life of Petunia Dursley, whether she had one, what shape it took, whether it bore any relationship to the exterior she presented, was entirely unknown to him. He thought, she brought me water. He looked at the glass in his hands. He thought, she has always brought me water, in the sense that there has always been water in the house, and she has never actively prevented him from accessing it, which was perhaps not the same thing at all. And yet, this morning, she had filled a glass and carried it outside and set it down. And those were three specific actions that had required specific decisions. And he was sitting here in the garden, and she had seen him sitting here, and she had done those things. He finished the water, set the glass down on the bench beside him. A bee arrived. It came from the direction of the climbing rose in the corner, the stubborn one, the one growing in 3 directions, and made a circuit of the bench with the unhurried confidence of something that has been doing this sort of thing for a very long time and has no concerns about doing it correctly. It investigated the empty glass briefly, found it uninteresting, and moved on to the roses proper, disappearing into the nearest bloom with complete conviction. Harry watched it go. He thought about Hogwarts, the way he had been thinking about Hogwarts all morning, in short, careful intervals, not dwelling, not allowing it to become longing or ache, just acknowledging that it existed, that it was a real place in the world, that in approximately 8 weeks he would be on a train heading toward it. The thought of Hogwarts was complicated this summer in a way it hadn't been before. It was still, underneath everything, home, in, the way that some places are simply and irrevocably home regardless of what has happened in and around them. But there was something else in it now too, something that had arrived in the graveyard and not left, a knowledge that the castle's warmth and the firelight in the common room and the smell of the great hall at dinner could exist alongside the other things, the darker things, without cancelling them out, He had thought, in the weeks before summer, that going back to Hogwarts would fix something, that being in the place would repair the feeling. He understood now, sitting in the garden on a bench that had nothing magical about it, that it would not work like that you could not put something down by going somewhere else, that the something came with you, tucked into your luggage alongside your robes and your books and your Hogwarts letter. He thought about Cedric again, or not exactly thought about him, but felt the familiar shape of him, the weight of his presence in the room of Harry's mind, where he had taken up residence. It had surprised Harry in those first days how persistent Cedric was. He had not known him well. They had not been friends in the ordinary sense. And yet here he was, returning with the regularity of something unresolved. He thought, maybe that is why. Because it is unresolved. Because there is no resolution available. Because Cedric had been alive and then had not been, with no process in between, no preparation, no ceremony of understanding. And that absence of process had left something open in Harry that ordinary grief, if there were such a thing, might not have. He was not sure he knew how to close it. He was not sure, sitting in the garden with the bee moving through the roses and the summer pressing down warm and ordinary, that closing it was the correct ambition. Petunia came to the window. She did not open it this time. It was already open, the curtains drawn part way against the sun. She appeared in the gap between them, and for a moment, no more than a moment, perhaps 5 seconds, perhaps less, she simply stood there and looked at Harry in the garden. She was wearing her good cardigan, the blue one. Her hair was done the way she always did it for church on Sundays, neat and considered. She was holding a tea towel, folded over one hand in the way of someone who has been in the middle of drying something and has temporarily put that on hold. Harry looked at her. She did not smile. She did not nod. Her expression was not unkind. It was not warm, precisely, but it was not unkind. It was the expression of someone who is looking at something they are trying to understand and are not sure they can. Then she stepped back from the window, and she was gone. The curtain settled. Harry looked at the space where she had been. He thought, and he turned the thought over carefully, the way you turn something fragile over to examine it. He thought that she had been about to say something. Not today, necessarily. Not in this specific moment. But at some point in the years of his childhood, at some point in the accumulated weight of all the days he had lived in this house, she had been about to say something and had not said it, and the not saying had built up into a kind of pressure that existed in the kitchen and the garden and the specific quality of the silence between them. He did not know what the something was. He suspected she didn't entirely know either. He thought about Dumbledore, about the things Dumbledore knew and did not share, about the way information moved through the adults in Harry's life in ways he had never been fully party to. He thought about why Dumbledore had placed him here, specifically in this house, with this woman who had been Lily's sister and who kept her feelings behind a cardigan and a tea towel and a glass of water delivered without words. There is something here, Dumbledore had said, or versions of it. A protection, Harry thought. Maybe the protection is stranger and more complicated than magic. He was not sure what he meant by that. He let the thought sit unexamined. The afternoon was coming. He could feel it in the way the light was changing, the sharp morning clarity softening into something fuller and more golden, the shadows moving with the slow confidence of something that had all the time in the world. The bee had finished with the roses and gone elsewhere. The radio from further along the street had switched to a different program, something with voices rather than music, the sound carrying on the warm air in fragments, a laugh, a sentence, a pause. Harry picked up the empty glass from beside him on the bench. He held it in his hands, the ordinary glass, the kitchen glass, the glass that Petunia had filled and carried and set down on the wall without explanation. It was warm now from the sun and from his hands. It was entirely unremarkable. He thought about what Ron would say. If he were here, Ron would say something about Petunia. Something probably a bit rude and probably accurate and possibly funny, the way Ron's observations often were. And it would make Harry laugh, and the laughter would cut through the heaviness of the morning in the way Ron's presence often cut through heavy things without seeming to try. He missed Ron with a sudden and specific sharpness that surprised him. Not a wave of it, just a precise and particular awareness of the absence of someone who should, in the natural order of things, be nearby. He thought about Hermione, who would not have said anything immediately, who would have sat beside him on this bench, probably, and read something for a while, and eventually said something so specific and thoughtful that it would have changed the shape of what he was thinking, without his being able to say exactly how. He missed her too. He missed both of them, in the solid, undramatic way you miss something that is not gone, but simply elsewhere. He stood up from the bench. He walked to the back door and opened it and stepped inside. The kitchen was cool after the garden warmth, slightly dim behind the partly drawn curtains. It smelled of the morning's tea and something Petunia had been preparing for lunch. Something on the cooker, something ordinary. Petunia was at the counter. She had her back to him. Harry set the empty glass on the counter beside the sink, in the place where glasses went to be washed. She did not turn around, but something in her posture, some slight shift, some small and barely perceptible change in the set of her shoulders, acknowledged it. Harry went upstairs. He did not go to his bedroom. He sat on the top stair for a while, looking down at the hallway below, and thought about the afternoon ahead, which was long and unstructured, and asked nothing of him, and found that he did not mind it. The stillness that had settled over him in the garden had come inside with him. It was not comfort. It was not the absence of grief. It was simply a kind of space, a room inside himself that was larger than he had known it to be, and quieter, and which could apparently contain quite a lot. He thought about the climbing rose in the corner, growing in 3 directions at once, not because it had been asked to, not because it was trying to prove something, simply because it was a rose, and it was summer, and this was what roses did when no one stopped them. He sat on the top stair and looked at the hallway and let the afternoon begin. He went back outside after lunch. Lunch had been a quiet affair, the Dursley household variety of quiet, which was not the garden's variety of quiet at all. The garden's quiet had been open and undemanding, the kind that simply existed without requiring anything of the people inside it. The kitchen's quiet was a different species entirely. It had edges. It was aware of itself. Vernon had not been home. He was at work, as he always was, on weekdays, performing whatever it was that Vernon Dursley performed in an office somewhere in the direction of the M25. And so, lunch had been Petunia, moving between the cooker and the counter with her particular economy of movement, and Dudley eating with the focused concentration of someone who considers eating a serious undertaking, and Harry sitting at the table with a plate of food in front of him that was entirely adequate and entirely beside the point. Nobody had said much. Petunia had asked Dudley something about his friend Piers, and Dudley had responded in the grunting monosyllabic way that teenage boys respond to questions from their mothers when they are occupied with food, and Petunia had said something that functioned as a response to this. And then there had been the sounds of cutlery and the radio in the background, turned low to a station that played songs from the decade before Harry had been born. Harry had eaten his food and not been part of any of it, which was normal enough. What was not normal, or rather, what was different from the way it had been for as long as Harry could remember, was that Petunia had given him the same amount as Dudley, not approximately the same or nearly the same, but actually the same number of sandwiches, cut the same way, with the same glass of squash beside each plate. Harry had noticed this in the peripheral way that you notice things which are not exactly surprising, but are nevertheless different from what you expected. And he had not remarked on it, and neither had anyone else. And the meal had proceeded and concluded, and the plates had been cleared, and Harry had gone back outside. The garden in the afternoon was a different place from the garden in the morning. This was not a poetic observation, but a practical one. The morning garden had been quiet in the way of something not yet begun. Tentative light, cool air, the sense of the day holding its breath. The afternoon garden was committed. The sun was fully overhead now, pressing down with the generous insistence of a July that had decided to behave like a proper July. The roses were thoroughly open. The grass had dried completely from the morning dew and was beginning to take on the faint yellowish tinge that grass acquires when it has been warm for several days in succession. The climbing rose in the corner had caught the full light and was doing something almost aggressively alive with it, its disordered blooms bright against the fence. Harry sat on the bench, which was now in partial shade from the fence, and looked at the garden. He looked at it for a while in the same way he had been looking at things all day, present but not pressing, aware but not demanding anything of the awareness. Then he looked at the paving stones, and then, without particular intention, he was looking for the ant. There were, as it turned out, considerably more than one. He had to look for a moment before he found them, because they were moving along the join between two paving stones, rather than across the face of one, which made them harder to spot until you knew where to look. But once he'd found them, he could see the trail clearly. A thin, purposeful line of movement running along the stone join from somewhere beneath the flower bed at the left to somewhere beneath the bench at the right. Each ant carrying something, or moving empty in the direction of carrying something. The whole enterprise proceeding with a kind of collective, unhurried certainty that was rather impressive when you stopped to watch it. Harry stopped to watch it. He shifted forward on the bench and leaned his elbows on his knees, which brought his eyes close enough to the paving to see the individual ants with something approaching proper clarity. They were small and very dark, and they moved with the particular quick efficiency of creatures that do not experience doubt about their direction. Some of them were carrying things, fragments mostly, too small to identify at this distance, though one ant near the bench leg appeared to be managing something that might have been a seed. Most of them were simply moving, purposeful and undecorated, going about the invisible business of the colony with the steadiness of something that has been doing this since long before this garden existed and will continue doing it long after, he thought. They don't know about any of it either. The thought was not bitter. It was simply factual, like the thought about the postman. The postman had not known. The children on the bicycles had not known. The lawnmower at number 7 had not known. The bee in the roses had not known. And now the ants, going about their colony business with absolute absorption, carrying their fragments along the join between 2 paving stones in a Surrey garden in July. They did not know either. The world was comprehensively full of things that did not know, and they were all simply continuing in the way that things continue, because continuing was what things did. There was something in this that was not consoling exactly, but was adjacent to consoling, something in the sheer scale of the not knowing, something in the way the world's indifference, which he had felt all morning as a kind of wound, was also simply the nature of things. The ants were not ignoring Cedric Diggory. They were not being callous. They were carrying their fragments and going about their business, because carrying fragments and going about business was the entirety of their relationship with the world. And the world, as they experienced it, did not include Cedric Diggory at all. This, Harry thought, was not the ants' failing. He was not sure whose failing it was. He was not sure it was anyone's. The afternoon deepened. Harry lay back on the grass beside the bench at some point. He couldn't have said exactly when the transition happened, only that at a certain point, sitting on the bench had started to feel like more effort than lying on the grass, and so he lay on the grass and looked at the sky. It was very blue, not the complicated blue of early morning or the fading blue of evening, but the full, committed blue of summer midday, the kind of blue that seems to have no ceiling, that goes on and on until it becomes something you simply can't see the end of. He watched a cloud move across it. It was a small cloud, not particularly cloud-like, more of a smear of white against the blue, the way paint looks when you've almost cleaned a brush. It moved with great slowness from left to right across Harry's field of vision, and he watched it go, and it went, and the blue was uninterrupted again. He thought about Hogwarts, not with longing and not with dread, with something more like the feeling you get when you think about a room you know very well, the common room fireplace, the specific quality of the light through the dormitory window on a winter morning, grey and cold, and somehow deeply familiar, the smell of the great hall before a meal, the warm starchy smell of food being prepared, mixed with the particular smell of many people gathered together, mixed with something that was simply Hogwarts, that Harry had never been able to identify individually, but recognized completely. He thought about the library, which he had always experienced primarily as a place Hermione went and occasionally required him to visit. He thought about the way the library looked in the late afternoon, when the light came through the high windows at an angle and made the dust motes visible in long, golden columns between the shelves. He had been in the library on a late afternoon once last year, early in the term, when Hermione had insisted on showing him some reference for a herbology essay, and he had looked up from the book she'd placed in front of him and seen the dust motes in the light and thought, without articulating it, without even registering it properly at the time, something like, "This is a good place to be." He thought about that now. He thought, that thought had been possible because I was not carrying anything yet that autumn. The tournament had not begun. Cedric had not been selected. The goblet had not yet been lit. He thought, I did not know that afternoon in the library would be one of the last afternoons I would sit in a place and simply notice that it was good to be there. He was not sure this was true. He was not sure that such afternoons were permanently over. He was not sure of anything very much, lying on the grass watching the sky, except that the sky was blue and the ants were going about their business, and somewhere above him the clouds were moving with tremendous slowness toward wherever clouds go. He thought about Ron. He thought about Ron the way you think about someone who is simply and thoroughly your friend. The familiar contours of it, the ease of it, the specific and unrepeatable particular of that person's company. He thought about Ron laughing. He thought about Ron being annoyed, the particular way Ron was annoyed, which was wholehearted and transparent and over quickly, without residue. He thought about the chess set Ron had brought back from somewhere the previous Christmas, the one where the pieces gave unsolicited opinions about your moves, and the knight had very decided views on the subject of castling. He thought about Hermione. He thought about Hermione the way you think about someone whose presence is a specific kind of reassurance. Not comfort exactly, but the reassurance of someone who takes things seriously and expects you to take things seriously too, and in whose company the world tends to come into slightly sharper focus. He thought about Hermione when she was irritated with him for not having done something she'd told him to do, which was often, and which was somehow as much a part of her company as anything else. He thought about Hermione when she was genuinely worried, the way her face changed, the way the competence became something more naked, something more human beneath it. He missed them both in the simple, direct way you miss people who are simply and directly part of your life. He thought, in 8 weeks, I will be on the Hogwarts Express. He thought, Ron will probably have something to eat. He thought, Hermione will probably have something to read. He thought, I will sit between them and look out the window at the countryside going past. And at some point, someone will say something, and someone else will respond, and it will be entirely ordinary, and I will be there. These thoughts did not fix anything. He was not under the impression that they should, but they lay beside him in the grass like objects set down gently, present and real and waiting without urgency to be picked up again when the time came. He had been on his back for a long time when he became aware of a shadow. Not a dramatic shadow, not a person standing over him, not anything sudden. Just the slow creep of the fence shadow as the sun moved, which had been happening gradually all afternoon, and which had now, at whatever hour this was, reached Harry's feet and was working its way up his legs with the unhurried thoroughness of something that has all the time in the afternoon to complete its business. He looked at the shadow for a moment. He thought, The shadow is the fence doing what fences do when the sun moves. The fence does not know it is casting a shadow. The shadow does not know it is a shadow. This is simply what happens when you put a fence in a garden with a sun above it. He thought this with something that was not quite amusement, but was shaped similarly. He sat up. The garden had changed while he had been lying in it. The afternoon had tilted imperceptibly toward the later part of itself. The quality of the light had shifted from the full pressing heat of midday to something slightly less insistent, something that suggested the eventual arrival of evening without committing to it yet. The roses had moved slightly in a breeze Harry hadn't noticed while lying down. The ants were still at it along the paving stone join, their business apparently inexhaustible. Harry looked at the ants for a moment longer. He thought about the ant he had watched first thing in the morning, the single ant with the fragment too large for it, moving with absolute purpose across the face of the paving stone. He had lost track of it eventually. He had no idea whether it had made it to wherever it had been going. He had no way of knowing. The ant had simply passed beyond the range of his attention, and whatever had happened after that had happened without him. He thought, maybe that is all you can ever do. Pay attention to what is in front of you for as long as it is in front of you. Carry the thing. Go forward. Let the things you can't see anymore have happened the way they happened. He turned this thought over carefully. He was not sure if it was wisdom or just a thing he had made up to make himself feel better. He was not sure there was always a reliable way to tell the difference. The sun moved, the shadow advanced, the ants carried on. The afternoon had gone long and golden by the time Dudley appeared again. Harry had returned to the bench at some point after lying in the grass. The shadow from the fence had reached his shoulders, and the ground beneath him had begun to feel less comfortable than it had in the earlier warmth, the way ground always does when you have been lying on it long enough for it to communicate its true nature. He was sitting in the familiar posture he had occupied for most of the day, hands on his knees, back at a slight angle to accommodate the bench's left side lean, eyes on the middle distance of the garden without particularly demanding anything of it. He heard the back door open. He did not turn around. He had developed, over the course of the day, a particular relationship with the sound of the back door, an unhurried awareness of it that registered the sound without immediately requiring a response. The morning's openings had been petunia, measured and purposeful. Dudley's first appearance had announced itself differently, heavier and less certain. This one announced itself as Dudley again, and Harry knew it before he turned around, and so he did not turn around immediately, but simply registered it and let it sit for a moment. The footsteps did not retreat. That was different. This morning, Dudley had appeared and stopped and looked and gone back inside, carrying the football that had apparently been his reason and then, just as apparently, not been his reason, and the going back inside had happened within the space of a minute or two, and Harry had watched the door close and thought nothing in particular about it. This time, the footsteps stopped and did not reverse. Harry heard, instead, the sound of something, someone, lowering themselves onto the back step, the slight grunt of it, the settling. He turned then. Dudley was sitting on the back step, not standing in the doorway, not hovering at the edge of the garden with an object in his hands as pretext, sitting properly on the back step with his large legs extended in front of him and his elbows on his knees, which mirrored Harry's own posture in a way that was probably coincidental and was nevertheless mildly strange to observe. He was not looking at Harry. He was looking at the middle distance of the garden, which was what Harry had been looking at, and he had the expression of someone who has made a decision and is now engaged in the slightly awkward business of following through on it. He was not carrying anything. No football, no pretextual object of any kind. He had simply come outside and sat down. Harry looked at him for a moment, the large familiar profile of his cousin, the blunt features that had been the face of so much of Harry's childhood difficulty, the way he sat with his weight distributed, as though he had always taken up more space than average and had long since stopped noticing. And then Harry turned back to the garden. They sat in silence. It was not an entirely comfortable silence, but it was not hostile either. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who do not have a history of talking and are both finding out whether talking is a thing that might happen now, without the benefit of a map for the territory. Harry waited. Dudley was the one who had sat down. It seemed reasonable that Dudley should be the one to say something, if something was going to be said. The garden was warm and still. A pigeon had landed on the fence at the far end and was conducting itself with the supreme self-satisfaction of pigeons on fences. The roses gave off their faint warm smell. Somewhere in the middle distance, a car went past on the road beyond the houses. Dudley picked at the sole of his trainer. He did this for a while, methodically, without apparent aim, working at a small piece of rubber that had begun to separate at the toe. It was a displacement activity, Harry recognized, the thing your hands do when your mind is occupied elsewhere. He had seen Dudley do similar things before, without particularly noting it. The fidgeting of someone who is more uncomfortable inside their own head than outside it, and whose hands know this even when the head doesn't. After what might have been 5 minutes, Dudley said, "Was he your friend?" Harry did not answer immediately. The question deserved consideration. Not because it was a complicated question. It was, in fact, a structurally simple question, the kind with a yes or no answer built in. But because the honest answer was one he had not exactly articulated to himself yet, and he found that he wanted to give the honest answer, which required locating it first. He turned it over. He thought about Cedric at breakfast in the great hall, laughing with his whole face. He thought about Cedric in the maze, the arrangement they had made, the way they had moved through the darkness together, neither of them fully trusting the other, and neither of them entirely without trust either. Some improvised middle ground between alliance and competition that had felt almost like something else by the end. He thought about Cedric at the third task, standing at the entrance to the maze with his family in the stands, looking the way people look when they are trying to appear calm and are managing it only partially. He thought about the portkey, about the two of them arriving in the graveyard, still holding the cup, about Cedric's confusion, the same confusion Harry had felt, the disorientation of a place that was wrong, the reaching for understanding that the situation would not permit, about the green light. He thought, I did not know him well. We were not in each other's lives in the ordinary way of friends. We did not seek each other out. We did not choose each other's company. We did not share the accumulated daily texture of two people who have decided they like each other and act accordingly. We were competitors. We were, at certain moments, something closer than that. But we never had the time to work out what. He said, "No." He paused. "Not really." He looked at the fence where the pigeon had been. It had gone while he wasn't watching. "But he should have gone home," Harry said. Dudley was quiet for a moment. Harry glanced at him. Dudley was still looking at the middle distance of the garden, his hands now still on his knees, the trainer soul abandoned. His expression was difficult to read, not because it was concealed, but because it was genuinely complicated, which was not an expression Harry was accustomed to seeing on Dudley's face. Dudley's face had historically been a fairly reliable surface for uncomplicated emotions: satisfaction, irritation, amusement, boredom. This expression was something else, something that suggested Dudley was processing something he didn't have the exact vocabulary for. He said, "How did he die?" Harry said, "He was killed." He said it simply, without elaboration. The way you say a thing when the elaboration is too large for the conversation, but the thing itself can at least be true. Dudley nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing with something, but acknowledging that they have received it, that it has landed. He said, "Were you there?" Harry looked at the garden. "Yes," he said. Another silence, longer this time, the kind of silence that has taken on some weight. Dudley said, "That's rough." It was such a thoroughly Dudley thing to say, so unembellished, so stripped of any pretension to adequate response, that Harry almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it was precisely as much as Dudley had to offer, and Dudley had offered it without varnish. "Yeah," Harry said. "It is." They sat for a while longer. The silence had changed. It was the same silence in the sense that neither of them was talking, but the quality of it was different from before, less uncertain, less pressurized, more like the silence that settles after something has been said and doesn't need to be said again. Harry found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not find Dudley's presence particularly intrusive. This was remarkable in the way that things are remarkable when they quietly contradict something you'd assumed without examination. He had assumed, or simply never questioned, that Dudley's presence was inherently irritating. It had been, for most of his life, the specific irritation of someone who has power over you and exercises it carelessly. This was something different. This was just a large person sitting on a back step in the sun who had asked a question and received an answer, and who was now simply here. Harry thought, "I don't know anything about Dudley either." This thought arrived with a gentleness that surprised him. He had spent 14 years in this house, in this person's daily proximity, and he knew almost nothing about Dudley that was not related to the mechanics of their conflict. He did not know what Dudley thought about. He did not know whether Dudley had things he was afraid of, beyond the Dementors, which had apparently done something to him last summer that had altered him in ways Harry had noted without investigating. He did not know what Dudley wanted his life to look like, or whether he thought about this at all, or whether the expectation that he would simply be Vernon's son and then a larger version of Vernon was something Dudley found comfortable or confining. He had never asked. There had never been the kind of ground between them on which asking would have been possible. There were years of history in the way, thick years, layered years, the years of the cupboard under the stairs and smeltings, and the campaign to make Harry's childhood as difficult as possible, all of it deposited between them like sediment, too accumulated to simply step over. But Dudley had come outside. Dudley had sat down on the step. Dudley had asked whether someone was Harry's friend, and received the answer, and said, "That's rough," and meant it in whatever way Dudley was capable of meaning things. Harry thought, that is something. That is genuinely something. The sun had moved further. The shadows of the fence were longer now, lying across the garden at a shallower angle. The particular lengthening of late afternoon that was not quite the beginning of evening, but was already thinking about it. The warmth was still substantial, but had lost the pressing quality of midday. It had become the kind of warmth you settle into rather than endure. Dudley was still on the step. He had gone back to looking at nothing in particular, his large hands loose on his knees. He had eaten an apple at some point in the past few minutes. Harry had registered this peripherally, the smell of it, the sounds of it, and had set the core on the step beside him with the same absent precision with which he did most things, as though his hands had a logic independent of whatever his head was doing. Harry thought about the Dementors. He had not thought about them directly in the context of Dudley before, had registered in the aftermath of last summer that Dudley had been affected in some way, that the experience had taken something out of him or left something in him that had not been there before. He had not asked about it then. It had seemed too complicated, too much history in the way, and Dudley had not offered anything, and Harry had not pressed, and the summer had ended, and the year had begun, and other things had happened, and then Cedric. But sitting here now, in the long, late afternoon, with Dudley on the step, and the garden quiet between them, Harry thought about what a Dementor encounter felt like from the inside. The cold, the despair, the specific cruelty of being made to feel the worst things you had ever felt, as though they were the only things you had ever felt. He thought about what a Dementor encounter might feel like if you had no context for it, no framework of the magical world, no Lupin to explain it afterwards and give you chocolate and sit with you while you came back to yourself. Dudley had been alone with it. That had not occurred to Harry before with any particular force. Dudley had experienced that in a back alley in Little Whinging, with no explanation and no preparation and no one to tell him what it was. And the best Harry had managed in the immediate aftermath had been defensive and insufficient. He thought, I was not kind about that either. This was becoming something of a pattern in the day's thinking. These small, retroactive discoveries, these minor revisions. He was not flagellating himself with them. They were not accompanied by particular guilt. They arrived more like corrections to a map, small adjustments to the understanding of a territory he had thought he knew. Dudley said eventually, "You're going back, in September." It was not a question. "Yeah," Harry said. Dudley appeared to consider this. "To that school?" "Yes." Dudley nodded, a single, slow nod. He picked up the apple core from the step beside him and turned it in his hands. "Is it—" he started, and then stopped. Harry waited. Dudley appeared to decide against whatever he had been about to ask. He stood up, slowly, with the particular effort of a large person rising from a low surface and brushed something from the back of his shorts. He looked at the apple core, then at the garden, then briefly, and with an expression Harry could not entirely interpret, at Harry. He said, "Mum made biscuits." Harry looked at him. "They're on the counter," Dudley said. "If you want." He went inside. The door closed behind him, not slammed, not even firmly, just closed in the ordinary way of a door that has been used and then not needed anymore. Harry listened to his footsteps move through the kitchen and away down the hall, the particular heavy rhythm of Dudley navigating the interior of his own house. And then the footsteps were gone, and it was just the garden again. Harry looked at the closed door. He thought about the biscuits on the counter. He thought about Dudley saying, "if you want," which was, in the vocabulary of their relationship, in the long archive of what had and hadn't been said between them over 14 years. A mildly extraordinary thing. He thought about the question Dudley had started and not finished. Is it what? Harry turned the fragment over. Is it worth it? Is it safe? Is it what you want to go back to? Is it good? He thought he would probably never know what Dudley had been going to ask, but the question had been there, begun and then put away, carefully, like something too new to be spoken fully. That was something too. The garden was quiet again, in the way it had been quiet all day, the long, even quiet of a summer afternoon doing exactly what summer afternoons do. The roses, the grass with its faint yellow tinge, the ants still at their business along the paving stone join, or different ants by now, perhaps. The colony's work continuing through shifts Harry had no way of distinguishing. The climbing rose in the corner, catching the late light. Harry sat on the bench and looked at it all and let the day continue around him and thought about nothing very dramatically and felt the weight of everything that had happened and did not try to put it down. The door was inside. The biscuits were on the counter. He would go in eventually. For now, he stayed where he was, in the warm late afternoon, with the shadows growing longer across the garden that did not know anything and was beautiful regardless. Vernon's car turned into Privet Drive at 6:10. Harry knew the sound of it before he saw it, the particular engine note of Vernon's company car. A sound so thoroughly embedded in the architecture of summers at number 4 that his body registered it before his mind did. A slight unconscious adjustment, the way you adjust to a change in weather before you have consciously noticed the clouds. He had heard that sound arrive at the end of the working day for as long as he could remember, and it had always meant the same thing, the household reconfiguring itself around a new center of gravity, Petunia becoming slightly more alert in the kitchen, Dudley becoming slightly less audible upstairs, the whole house performing its evening routine of accommodation. Harry did not move from the bench. He heard the car slow and stop. The engine cut. The particular chunk of a car door that has been manufactured to sound substantial. Footsteps on the front path. Vernon's footsteps, heavier than Petunia's, more deliberate. The footsteps of a man who has spent a day being important somewhere and is now transferring that importance to the domestic sphere. The front door opening. The sounds of arrival. The briefcase set down in the hall. The particular exchange of sounds between Vernon and Petunia that constituted their evening greeting, tonal rather than verbal from this distance. The rhythm of two people who have been doing this for many years. Then, after a moment, silence. Then the sound of someone moving through the kitchen. The curtain moved. Harry was looking at the garden when it happened, not at the kitchen window specifically, but in the direction of it, which was enough to catch the movement in his peripheral vision. The curtain on the right side of the kitchen window, the one Petunia had drawn part way against the afternoon sun, shifted. Not dramatically, not the purposeful drawing back of someone who wants to see outside clearly, just the slight displacement of fabric that happens when someone standing close to a window moves, or turns, or simply stands there long enough that their proximity disturbs the air. Vernon was at the window. Harry knew this the way he had known things all day, not through direct confirmation, but through the accumulated logic of the household, the sequence of sounds and movements that added up to a conclusion. Vernon had come in, and Vernon had been told, or had noticed, because Petunia would have told him, or the glass on the counter would have been evidence, or simply the opened back door, that Harry was in the garden, and Vernon had come to the kitchen window to verify this for himself. Harry looked at the curtain. The curtain was still. Whatever assessment was being conducted behind it was being conducted without visible movement now. Harry looked back at the garden. He thought about what Vernon was thinking, and found the exercise mildly interesting in the detached way that things are interesting when you are too tired for anything more. Vernon would be thinking something about the garden and the bench and the fact of Harry sitting on it. Vernon's thoughts about Harry had always been visible in Vernon's face with remarkable transparency, which was perhaps why Vernon had never made any particular effort to conceal them. The irritation, the wariness, the specific discomfort of a man who has something in his house that he does not understand and cannot control, and has therefore decided to simply not look at directly. Today, apparently, he was looking. Then the curtain shifted again, and the shadow behind it moved away, and the kitchen window was just a kitchen window again, with the curtain drawn against the fading sun. Harry thought, "That is the most Vernon has communicated to me today." He thought this without particular bitterness. It was simply true. The evening smell arrived before the evening light. It came through the open kitchen window, the smell of something being cooked, warm and starchy and entirely ordinary. Petunia's cooking had always occupied a specific sensory register in Harry's experience of this house, competent, precise, entirely without adventure. She made the same things in the same ways on the same rotation, and the result was food that was reliably adequate and reliably without surprise, which was perhaps what the household required. Tonight, it smelled like shepherd's pie. Harry had always liked shepherd's pie, in the quiet and unexpressed way that he liked things he was not sure he was supposed to like. He had eaten it many times in this house without ever saying so. It had been one of the small, undeclared facts of the domestic arrangement that Petunia made things Harry liked without apparently intending to make things Harry liked, or perhaps without acknowledging the intention. The way you can do something for someone without admitting that you are doing it. He thought about this for a moment. He thought about the glass of water this morning, and the equal portion at lunch, and the biscuits Dudley had mentioned on the counter. He thought about the way Petunia had stood at the window for 5 seconds in the morning and then stepped back without saying anything. He thought about all the years of adequate meals and the cupboard that had eventually become a bedroom, and the Hogwarts letter that had been opened, and the way she had looked at it before Vernon had taken it away. He thought, there is a whole other story here that I don't know. It was not a new thought exactly. He had circled it at various points in the day, but it arrived now with more weight than it had before. Something about the smell of the cooking and the evening and the long, slow day settling around him like sediment. There was a whole other story in this house, a story that existed beneath the one he knew, or alongside it, or in the spaces between all the things that had never been said. He had always experienced the Dursleys as an obstacle, as something to be endured and escaped. He could be honest about this in the garden on this particular evening. He had never seriously considered them as people with interior lives that had nothing to do with him. This did not resolve into forgiveness. It was not that tidy. The years of the cupboard were the years of the cupboard, and certain things did not become fine simply because the person who had done them was also, separately, a person. But it was something. It was a small adjustment to the map, another correction to a territory he had been navigating with incomplete information. He let it sit. The light changed. It happened gradually, and then, suddenly, all at once, the afternoon light tipping without announcement into the golden light of early evening, that particular quality of light that turns everything it touches briefly and completely beautiful. The roses caught it and held it in their petals. The grass took on a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The fence at the end of the garden, the ordinary wooden fence that had been there as long as Harry could remember and had never been anything other than a fence, became for a moment something out of a painting. Golden-edged, particular, chosen. Harry looked at it. He thought about the great hall at Hogwarts on autumn evenings when the candles were lit and the enchanted ceiling had gone the deep blue of early night, and the light was warm on every face around every table. He thought about the specific and unrepeatable quality of being in that room, the noise of it, the warmth of it, the sense of being contained in something larger than yourself that was also entirely safe. He had taken that feeling for granted. He knew most people take the things that contain them for granted because the containing is so constant, it becomes invisible. He thought about the first time he had seen the Great Hall. 11 years old, coming in from the entrance chamber, still soaking wet from crossing the lake, the candles overhead and the 4 tables and all the faces turning. He had felt that he was somewhere, not somewhere specific that he had been before, but somewhere in a deeper sense, the sense of a place that would hold him. He had not had the words for it then. He was not sure he had adequate words for it now, but he had felt it, and it had been real. And every year since then, the feeling had been underneath everything else, constant and quiet, the way foundations are constant and quiet. He thought, in 8 weeks, I will walk through those doors again. He thought, the doors will be the same doors. He held this thought carefully. The kitchen sounds had organized themselves into the rhythms of a meal being assembled. Petunia's movements, the particular percussion of preparation. A cupboard opened, something set on the counter, the cooker's click and light, the sound of water in the pot. These sounds had been the soundtrack of his evenings for 14 summers, and he knew every note of them, their sequence and their meaning, the way you know music you have never chosen but have heard so many times it has become internal. Vernon said something in the kitchen. Harry couldn't hear the words, only the sound of them, the particular carrying quality of Vernon's voice when he was speaking normally, without displeasure or performance. Petunia responded. Another exchange, brief and domestic, the verbal equivalent of the sounds they made when they passed each other in the hall. Not conversation exactly, but contact, the confirmation of presence. Then Vernon laughed. It was a short laugh at something Petunia had said, quick and apparently genuine, the laugh of someone who has been amused without expecting to be. Harry heard it and thought, Vernon laughs. He had known this, abstractly. He had witnessed it on occasions when Vernon's colleagues visited and Vernon performed bonhomie with the focused effort of a man who has decided to be charming and is managing it by force of will. But this was different. This was the private laugh, the laugh between two people in a kitchen in the evening, unrehearsed. He thought, they are a family in the kitchen. He thought, I have never been part of that family, and they have never made room for me in it. And it exists anyway, separate from me, the way things exist separately from us, regardless of whether we are included. He was aware that this was sad, in some register. He was aware that it might have been different. He was also aware, sitting in the garden at the end of a long day, that what was sad was not the same thing as what was wrong, and that the family in the kitchen had its own story that had nothing to do with him, and that he would be on a train in 8 weeks, and that the train led somewhere. The light had gone from gold to amber. The amber was slower than the gold. It lasted longer, deepened rather than faded, the way some things intensify in the moment before they end. The roses were very beautiful in the amber light. The stubborn climbing rose in the corner, the one growing in 3 directions, caught it fully and held it in a way that was almost excessive, almost too much beauty for a corner of a Surrey garden on an ordinary Thursday evening. Harry looked at it. He thought about Dumbledore. He thought about the hospital wing, about Dumbledore's voice speaking clearly and steadily into the silence after everything had happened, saying the name, Cedric Diggory, saying it like it meant something, because it did, saying, remember, saying it to a hall full of people who did not yet fully understand what they were being asked to remember, or why, or what it would cost. Harry thought, I have been remembering all day, not ceremoniously, not as a deliberate act of memorial, not standing with his head bowed in a chosen posture of grief, just sitting in a garden, watching ants, listening to the postman and the lawnmower and 2 children on bicycles, drinking a glass of water that had been brought without explanation, sitting beside his cousin in the late afternoon quiet, watching the light change through its colors. He thought, this is what remembering actually looks like, most of the time. Not candles and speeches, just continuing to exist in the ordinary world while carrying the weight of what you know, and not putting it down. The amber deepened. Inside the house, Petunia called Dudley for dinner. Her voice carried through the kitchen window, clear and domestic and entirely matter-of-fact. The voice she used for the practical business of the household, the voice that meant, come now. The meal is ready. Harry did not move. He watched the amber light on the climbing rose and let the evening settle over the garden and thought about nothing in particular and everything all at once, and the weight of the day was very heavy and also somehow bearable. The way things are bearable when you have simply sat with them long enough that they have become yours. The curtain moved once more in the kitchen window, then was still. The roses held the last of the amber light. The stars came out one at a time, not all at once, not in a sudden reveal, the way Harry had always imagined stars in stories, flung across the sky in a single dramatic gesture. They arrived individually, the way truths sometimes arrive. First one, barely visible, then another in a different part of the sky, then a third, until at some point you stopped counting individual appearances and simply understood that the sky was full of them and had been quietly filling for a long time without announcement. Harry was still in the garden. The bench was cool now. The warmth that had accumulated in the wood over the long sunny hours had given itself back to the evening air, and what remained was the wood's own temperature. Lower, more honest, the temperature of something that has stopped pretending to be warmer than it is. Harry's hands were cool where they rested on his knees. He had not thought to go inside and get a jumper. He was not particularly cold, not uncomfortably so, just aware of the temperature, the way you are aware of things at the end of a long day when the ordinary insulations of activity and distraction have worn thin. The garden was dark in a way it had not been at any other point in the day. Not completely dark. The sky still held some residual light at the horizon, the deep blue-grey of a sky that has not entirely finished deciding whether it is night. And the kitchen light was on inside the house, sending a rectangle of yellow through the back window across the paving stones. But the roses were invisible in their beds, present only as shapes and scent, and the paving stones were dark, and the grass was dark, and the climbing rose in the corner had become simply a mass of shadow against the darker shadow of the fence. Harry looked at the stars. He thought about the astronomy tower. He thought about it the way you think about a place, very well, not picturing it deliberately, but finding it already there in your mind, familiar and specific. The cold of the tower at midnight, the particular quality of the sky from that height, wider than it looked from the ground, more stars visible, and more space between them. Professor Sinistra's voice moving through the constellations with the steady, unhurried authority of someone who has loved the same thing for a long time, the scratch of quill on parchment. Ron, always slightly too tired at that hour, making notes that would require deciphering later. He thought about lying on his back on the astronomy tower's cold stone floor once. Not during a class, during one of the years when things had been very difficult and the common room had felt too crowded with noise and concern, and looking up at the sky and feeling briefly the particular relief of something enormous. The sky at that height was so large it made you small in a way that was not diminishing but freeing. You were very small under a sky that large. Your problems were not gone, but they were proportionate. He looked at the sky now from the garden of number 4, which was not the astronomy tower and had never been the astronomy tower, and found that the sky from here was larger than he had noticed before. The houses on either side blocked the lower portions of it, and the kitchen light interfered with the dark. But above all of that, above the roof lines and the telephone wires and the persistent orange glow of the street beyond, the sky was doing what it always did, which was to be enormous and full of stars and entirely indifferent to the particular geography beneath it. The same sky, Harry thought, from the astronomy tower or from a bench in Surrey, the same stars. He thought about next year, not in detail. His mind was too tired for detailed forward planning, the kind of thinking that required constructing specifics. He thought about it more the way you think about a destination when you are still far from it, not the particular rooms and streets and faces, but the general sense of a direction. Hogwarts in the autumn, the train through the countryside, the hills turning into something wilder as you went north, platform 9 3/4, the barrier that you walked through, and the smoke and the noise and the sudden organized chaos of a few hundred people all going to the same place. He thought, it will be different next year. He had known this already, or had known it in the way that you know things you have not yet fully admitted. Last year, he had arrived at Hogwarts under the long shadow of Voldemort's name, spoken again at the end of the previous year, attached to the diary and the chamber, and then to Sirius, and then to the graveyard. Each year there had been something new to add to the weight. He thought, next year there will be the weight of the graveyard, there will be the weight of Cedric's name, but there would also be, he turned this over carefully, there would also be the common room, there would be the fire, there would be Ron's chess set and Hermione's books and Neville's increasingly competent herbology and Ginny's sharp remarks and Dean's cartoons pinned to the dormitory wall and the smell of the great hall and Professor McGonagall's expression when you had done something right, which was not a warm expression but contained warmth nonetheless, distributed in a more compressed form. These things would still be there. They had been there before the graveyard. They would be there after it. Not unchanged. Nothing was unchanged, but present, real, continuing. He breathed out slowly into the cool night air. A light went off in the house. Not the kitchen light. That was still on, still sending its rectangle across the paving stones. A bedroom light. Dudley's window, which Harry could see from the bench at an angle, had been lit and was now dark. Dudley, going to bed with the straightforward approach he brought to most things, apparently having decided that the day was over and sleep was the correct response to this. Harry looked at the dark window for a moment. He thought about the question Dudley had started in the afternoon and not finished. Is it, he thought, is it worth it? Is it good? Is it what you want? He thought, yes, and also yes, and also yes, which is different from the first two yeses. He thought about what Dudley would make of Hogwarts if he could see it. He had thought about this before, occasionally, in the way you sometimes try to see a thing through someone else's eyes. He had always imagined Dudley would find it frightening or excessive or simply too strange to process. But sitting here in the dark garden at the end of a day in which Dudley had sat on the back step and asked about Cedric and offered biscuits, Harry thought, maybe frightened is not the only thing he would feel. Maybe under the fright there would be something else. He let the thought go, gently, without requiring it to resolve. He would go inside soon. He knew this the way you know things your body has already decided before your mind has caught up. The cool of the bench, the lateness, the particular quality of stillness that arrives when a day has genuinely finished rather than simply paused. The day was finished. It had been a long one, long in the way that days are long when you are carrying something through them rather than moving briskly forward, and it had contained more than he would have predicted this morning when he first sat down on the bench with the cool dew on the grass and the ant on the paving stone. He had not fixed anything. He had not resolved anything. Cedric was still dead, and the graveyard was still the graveyard, and September was still 8 weeks away, and the world outside the garden gate still did not know. None of that had changed. But something had. Something small and not entirely nameable. The kind of change that does not announce itself, but is present nevertheless. The way a room is different. After someone has quietly opened a window. He had sat in the garden for a whole day and let the world be ordinary around him, and not required it to be anything else. And he had thought about Cedric without the thinking destroying him, and he had received a glass of water and an equal portion at lunch and a mention of biscuits on a counter. And he had sat beside his cousin in the late afternoon and said something true. It was enough for one day. He looked at the stars one last time. They were the same stars that were visible from the astronomy tower. They were the same stars under which the Hogwarts grounds lay dark and quiet, waiting for September. They were the same stars that had been above the graveyard, and would be above the train platform, and would be above everything that was still to come, all the things he could not yet see the shape of. He stood. His legs were stiff from the long day and the cool of the evening, and he stretched them briefly, standing in the dark garden beside the bench that had not been his bench that morning, and was now, in some small, unceremonious way, slightly more familiar. He looked at the garden once more. The dark roses, the invisible ants on their paving stone, the climbing rose in the corner that was only a shape now against the sky. He went inside. The house was quiet. He set the empty glass in the sink. It had been there all day. The glass Petunia had brought him, sitting on the bench beside him, and then in his hands, and then on the ground by the grass, and then back on the bench. He set it in the sink carefully, in the same place where glasses went. He climbed the stairs. He passed Dudley's dark door. He passed the closed door of Vernon and Petunia's room, from behind which came the faint sound of the television turned low. He went into his own small bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The trunk at the foot of the bed was still half unpacked. His robes were still visible inside it. He did not unpack it now. He simply sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room and looked at the familiar ceiling, the yellowed white, the wandering crack, the small dark stain by the wardrobe. He lay down without changing clothes. He looked at the ceiling. He did not sleep straight away. But the thinking had gone quiet, in the way that thinking goes quiet at the end of a day that has asked enough of it, and what remained was simply the darkness and the ceiling and the faint sounds of the house settling around him, and somewhere outside the open window, the very distant sound of the night. He closed his eyes. He let the day be over. He let himself be still. There are days that do not make it into the histories. No one writes them down. No portrait remembers them. No ghost retells them in the corridors late at night when the castle is quiet and the candles have burned low. They leave no mark on the official record of things. No entry in a logbook. No mention in a letter. No footnote in any account of the larger events that surrounded them. They are simply days, ordinary ones, the kind that happen in the spaces between the moments that matter, or so it seems at the time. But sometimes, not always, Not even often, but sometimes. Those are the days that do the quiet work, the invisible work, the work that has no name and makes no noise and cannot be pointed to afterward as the reason anything changed. The work of sitting still long enough for something to settle. The work of letting the world be ordinary around you when ordinary is the last thing you feel. The work of carrying something heavy through an unremarkable Thursday without putting it down and without being destroyed by it. Harry Potter sat in a garden in Surrey for one long summer day in 1995, and nothing happened. The postman came, the lawnmower ran. 2 children rode bicycles down the street laughing about something. The ants went about their business. The roses were roses. The sky was blue and then gold and then amber and then full of stars as skies do when no one requires anything particular of them. And somewhere inside all that ordinariness, something was quietly, incrementally carried. He would go back to Hogwarts. He would face what needed to be faced. He would stand in the places he had stood before and find them changed and unchanged simultaneously, the way all beloved places are when you return to them after loss. He would sit by the common room fire with Ron and Hermione and let the familiar warmth of it reach him. And it would reach him because he had not closed himself against it. That day in the garden was part of how, not the whole of how, not a cure or a resolution or a turning point you could mark on a map of his life and say, here, this is where it changed. Just one quiet day, doing what quiet days do, which is hold you without ceremony, without asking anything in return. The garden still sits there on Privet Drive. The bench is still slightly uneven on the left side. The climbing rose still grows in 3 directions at once,